Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Order. Urgent question, Mr. John Redwood.
Will the government make a statement on the additional costs of staying in the EU Customs Union after 2020 and provide an updated estimate of the total costs of the current draft of the withdrawal agreement?
Thank you. Minister John Blair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every arm of government is working at pace to firm up and put in place all necessary arrangements to ensure that we are ready to leave and chart our own course as global Britain. The government will continue to update Parliament on the progress of the negotiations, and the Prime Minister will be updating the House shortly in this regard in a post-Council statement. Mr. Speaker, in respect of the Customs Union, common rules will remain in place throughout the implementation period to give businesses and citizens critical certainty. This will mean that businesses can trade on the same terms as now until the end of 2020. As the Prime Minister has said, a further idea has emerged, and it is an idea at this stage, an idea to create an option to extend the implementation period for a matter of months, and it would only be a matter of months. But as the Prime Minister made clear, this is not expected to be used because we are working to ensure that we have a future relationship in place by the end of December 2020. As the House will appreciate, the length and cost of any extension to the implementation period is subject to negotiations. Throughout the implementation period, we will continue to build our new relationship, one which will see the UK leave the single market and the customs union to forge our own path, pursue an independent trade policy while protecting jobs and supporting growth. Mr. Speaker, during the progression of our exit negotiations, we reached a financial settlement with the EU that did two things. It honoured our commitments made during our membership and ensured the fairest possible deal for UK taxpayers. In December, we estimated the size of the settlement to be between £35 to £39 billion, using reasonable assumptions and publicly available data. And the National Audit Office confirmed in April that this was reasonable. So, Mr. Speaker, this government is to upholding our parliamentary democracy through honouring the result of the referendum and remaining fully transparent with Parliament on the deal that is reached in advance of the meaningful vote.
Mr. John Redwood.
Well, the Treasury should do some calculations, because it would be an act of great rashness to agree to extend our period when we would be in another 7-year financial period for the EU, with all the consequences that might bring. It could be 15 billion or more for a year, and we would be probably having to accept liabilities that might extend for the whole 7-year financing period. And why wouldn't the EU front-end load their expenses when we were still in the thing? And why wouldn't they expect us to meet the forward commitments, as they say they want us to do, when we leave under the existing 7-year period? We are desperately in need of more money for our schools, for our hospitals, for universal credit. We need money so that we can honour our tax-cutting pledges, which we all made in our 2017 manifesto.
Order. I apologise for interrupting the right honourable gentleman, whose flow is difficult to stop, and I wouldn't want it to be stopped. The right honourable gentleman must be heard. Mr. Matheson, you are normally a most cerebral individual. Take a tablet. Mr. John Redwood.
Our economy has been slowed deliberately by a fiscal and monetary squeeze, which we need to. We need tax cuts to raise people's take-home pay so they have more spending power. All this is possible if we don't give 39 billion to the EU. And all this would be even more possible if we don't pledge another 15 or 20 billion for some time never, if we're now going to give in yet again. So when will this government stand up to the EU? When will it say that it wants a free trade agreement and it doesn't see the need to pay for it? And when will it roll out signing a withdrawal agreement, which is a surrender document which we cannot afford?
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for a number of budget representations on that point. What I can confirm is that when the sum of £35 to £39 billion was agreed, it was also agreed on three principles: that the UK would not be making its payments sooner than it would otherwise have done. It would be based on the actual rather than the forecast, and it would also mean that we would include all benefits as a member state. I recognise the wide range of concerns that exist in the House and those that are raised by the right honourable gentleman, but we are in a delicate stage of negotiations, but the Prime Minister will be speaking to the House shortly.
Mr Peter Dowd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, the brass neck of the right honourable gentleman. He spent 8 years. He spent 8 years being a cheerleader for austerity, and he comes today. It's unbelievable, Mr. Speaker. Among the Tory quarrelling, the Prime Minister's negotiations appear to succumb to a new failure every day. The Prime Minister has stood staring at the menu for 2 years while the Cabinet devours itself. It now seems it'll take a little bit longer for her to make up her mind, demanding that the EU give further time in relation to the transition period. And what we cannot fathom is how the government is unable to negotiate our exit within the period agreed, begging instead to make it longer. Humiliatingly, I've got to say, we hear that 95% of the agreement is done, as though that's supposed to reassure us, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps I could remind the government that 95% of the Titanic's journey was completed successfully. Meanwhile, the government has gone from discussing a backstop to discussing a backstop to a backstop, to requesting the extension to the transition. These don't signal a government about to emerge victoriously. So let me ask a couple of questions if this 95% deal is done. First, during the transition, the EU's trade policy, common external tariff and customs regime will continue to apply to the UK, but third countries will have no legal obligation to continue to treat the UK as if it were a member state. So what trilateral discussions has the government had, therefore, with both the EU and third country partners such as Mexico, South Korea, and all the other countries with which the EU has preferential trading agreements in place to ensure that the UK will continue to benefit from these arrangements during that transition period? And second, what progress has the government made towards acceding to agreements facilitating trade as the Pan-Euro-Mediterranean Convention that facilitates diagonal cumulation of origin which during the transition period and any deal thereafter? Mr. Speaker, these matters, along with the question of wider trade in goods, is easily resolvable with the transition period that has already been agreed. If this government had got its act together, there wouldn't be talk of additional time. The only thing that's costing this government is this useless government.
Well, it's difficult to discern the precise questions there, but I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments. I mean, the government is in a negotiation, and there are a number of issues that are not yet resolved. With respect to the final state around our future freedom to trade, those are matters that will be reported on to this House before there is a meaningful vote. So the honourable gentleman needs to be patient a little longer as we move through that last 5% and deal with those matters.
Order. I just gently remind the House that there is a further urgent question afterwards and then a statement by the Prime Minister, so I shall have to take a view as to the point at which we need to move on, but I will be assisted if colleagues are extremely brief. Justine Greening.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very concerned about the government's plans because essentially they mean us staying in a customs union over which we'll have no say over the rules for a prolonged period at the very moment the global economy is facing some significant risks. Can he explain how this is in the UK's national interest?
Correct.
Well, I've set forward the government's position with respect to the negotiation. And the idea about a modest extension in terms of months. It will be for my colleague, the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister to update the House sooner. But I would acknowledge that the right honourable lady's point with respect to the opportunities that exist beyond the EU in terms of finding a settlement that actually gives us the freedom to develop our trading relationships.
Kirsty Blackman.
Mr. Speaker, I was going to start my question by thanking the Chancellor for coming and thanking them for answering questions on the cost of Brexit. But it's not the Chancellor, and I'm afraid the Economic Secretary is not doing a very good job at answering the questions in relation to the cost of Brexit. Can he tell us, please, in the event of no agreement on staying in the customs union and the single market, what would be the loss in productivity to businesses in the UK and in Northern Ireland specifically. How many redundancies does he expect to see in Northern Ireland and in the UK? What is the lost cost to the UK economy of the EU citizens that have chosen not to come here or have chosen to leave as a direct result of the Brexit vote? And lastly, if he truly believes that we will be better off as a result of the UK leaving the EU without being in the customs union or the single market, can he tell us what his models say about how much better off each of us will be?
No, I can't give the Honourable Lady a cash figure for every member of the United Kingdom, but what I can say is the government is determined and the Treasury is determined to make preparations for all eventualities. That's why we are preparing 70 statutory instruments to take through this House in the event of a no deal. And the EU should be very clear that we are going to be ready for all eventualities whilst being committed to negotiating the best possible outcome, as directed by the British people 2 years ago.
Greg Hands.
Of course, it's the policy of the party opposite for us to remain in the customs union forever. Worth bearing in mind. But can my honourable friend perhaps give just a little bit of detail what work HMRC has done in the case that we are in the customs union but outside of the EU, in who determines things like trade preferences and who runs trade defences on behalf of this country in those years?
Well, I can confirm to my right honourable friend that these are matters that the government is engaged with intensively at the moment in terms of the negotiations, but is also working towards securing as much autonomy to the British government into the future. That is the mandate that we've been given by the British people.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister told the House a moment ago that the government expects the negotiations on the future relationship to be concluded by December 2020. However, when the government published its backstop proposal for Northern Ireland, it said that it expected those negotiations would be concluded at the latest by December 2021. Which of those two dates represents government policy?
The government policy is that we have a backstop arrangement in place in order to fulfil our obligations, and we are in a negotiation over the timings of that. But the Prime Minister will be coming to the House later today, and the Right Honourable Gentleman will have an opportunity to clarify with her the answer to that question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can my honourable friend inform me why he thinks there is any incentive for the EU to give us a good deal if they think by dragging their heels they will actually drag us into an extra amount of money that we may be obliged to pay towards them?
Minister.
There is no expectation that this government will be seeking to pay more money to the EU. We are in a negotiation, as has been set out, that we have made considerable progress. We have a small number of items to resolve, but it is our intention to get the best possible deal for the British taxpayer in the national interest.
Chris Leslie.
Will the Minister break it gently to the Right Honourable Member for Wokingham that far from saving us money, if we stay in the customs union and the single market, and quite frankly we remained in the European Union, we would save our constituents that £81 billion that will be lost to them otherwise? Not my calculations, his calculations, the Treasury's own calculations and forecasts last December. £81 billion worse off for our constituents and the Treasury if we leave on the WTO terms of the Right Honourable Member for Wokingham.
Minister.
I have to say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, I'm not sure my Right Honourable friend, the Member for Wokingham, has a lot of faith in the Treasury assumptions. So I feel there's little point in taking that figure back to him.
Antoinette Sandbach.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What businesses in my constituency want is certainty and reassurance that the border will be as frictionless as possible. This is key to many sectors of prosperity in the North West. Can the Minister confirm the costs involved in ongoing membership of a customs union on a temporary basis will dramatically be outweighed by the benefits to business?
Well, the government has to reconcile the decision of the British people to leave the EU, whilst also, as the Honourable Lady says, making the cost of business as little as possible. And that's why it's absolutely imperative that when we secure the final outcome of the negotiations, it is good for business, good for the economy and good for jobs.
Speaker, could the Minister set out the extra cost to UK GDP of leaving the customs union and the extra costs, particularly to businesses in Wokingham, of the hard Brexit favoured by the member for Wokingham?
Minister.
I think the Right Honourable Member for Wokingham has spoken for himself. The reality is that before we the government comes back to the House for a meaningful vote, a whole range of data will be supplied to the House in order to make that a meaningful discussion over that decision.
Mr. Johnny Elphick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure that my honourable friend, who's doing an excellent job today, will, like me, be an avid reader of the Conservative Manifesto, where it said the withdrawal agreement and future relationship be negotiated side by side. 95% of withdrawal agreement has been completed, which is great news. How much of the future relationship agreement has been done?
Zero. Minister.
I think at this stage we are clearly in a delicate negotiation, and it's important that the two are taken together. And the Prime Minister will be updating the House on the precise position that we're in on that negotiation then.
I understand the natural courtesy of the Honourable Gentleman inclines him to look in the direction of the person who's asking him the question, but it's helpful if he would face the House. We're grateful. It's not a serious sin. I'm just trying to aid and counsel the Honourable Gentleman in the discharge of his duties. Mrs Helen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's own statistics showed that leaving with no deal would put unemployment in the North East up to 20%. What's their calculation of the effect on unemployment in the North East of leaving the customs union?
Minister.
There are a range of assumptions around the implications of different scenarios. What the government is doing is seeking to ensure that we minimise the downsides and maximise the upsides in terms of the agreement that we come to. I recognise that there are significant industries in the North East that rely on a certainty in that relationship, and that's why it's very important that we get it right.
This modest extension that's only a plan is going to cost £15.6 billion. How will the honourable member explain that in Southend, Salisbury and Stockport? Can we use the money slightly better?
Minister.
Well, I would be in a position to justify it if it was a firm outcome of the negotiations. It's not. I haven't been conducting the negotiations, but the Prime Minister has, and I'm sure you'll be able to, the Honourable Gentleman will be able to ask the Prime Minister later.
Mr Nigel Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I ask what the purpose of any such extension may be? Is it to replace the Irish backstop, or is it in addition to?
Minister.
At the moment, this is an idea that has been raised. In terms of the detail of it, where it fits within negotiations, clearly the Prime Minister will be best placed to answer it. But what I would say to the Right Honourable Gentleman is that one of the enduring principles of our negotiations is to ensure that we treat the whole of the United Kingdom as a single united entity, and that is an enduring principle that is guiding us through these negotiations.
Succinctness as exemplified legendarily by the representative from North East Somerset, Mr Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Speaker, will my honourable friend say, if we stay in the customs union, whether any revenues that came from customs would be considered to be own resources?
Minister.
What I would say to my honourable friend is that we need to have a fair settlement that does the right thing by the people of this country.
Mary Cray.
To accentuate the positive, as the song goes, but he knows that the cost of Brexit is already being paid by every family and every business in this country. Higher prices in the shop, a staffing crisis in the NHS, and a hit to the public finances of £26 billion a year before Brexit has even happened. So can I ask him to resist the jingoism and fantasy maths of the English nationalists on his own side, and remember it is a red line for those of us on this side to stay in a customs union. The value of not returning to a hard border
Lady, but we must. Sorry, but we. Forgive me, interrupting the honourable lady, but we've got a lot to get through. Please forgive me. We must make progress, rather more quickly. Minister.
I don't accept that characterisation of any of my colleagues on this side of the House. We're seeking to secure the best deal in the national interest for the whole of the United Kingdom.
Single sentence. Mr. Peterbone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Minister aware that many people on this side of the House and in the country think £39 billion isn't worth paying, let alone any more?
Minister.
I would imagine that the honourable gentleman, like many of his constituents, would think that no sum is worth paying. Of course, there are a range of views on this matter, but what we've got to do is honour our obligations, as this country does, and secure a fair outcome.
Luciana Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thousands of people across Merseyside, including my constituents, are employed in the automotive and aerospace sectors. Our membership to the Customs Union is vital to supporting jobs and investment in our regional economy. What assessment has the Minister's Department made of the effect of leaving the Customs Union on these sectors? And does he agree with me that only staying in the Customs Union will ensure the future of these sectors?
The government have made an assessment that means that it's absolutely imperative that we come out with a solution that is right for those employers in her constituency and gives the certainty that they need, because that is what her constituents will require.
Any extension to the transition period is going to be costly. I think in that we can agree 15 billion, 16 billion, whatever it is. But the problem is that we will have no MEPs to represent us. We will have no say and no influence of any legislation introduced during that period. Does my honourable friend agree with me that there should be no taxation without representation?
My right honourable friend makes a very factual point, and that will be something that no doubt those that conducting the negotiations will have in top of mind.
Who's offering to do a short sentence? Ah, well done. Catherine West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There seem to be a number of questions which the Minister is not able to answer. Is his boss available, or is he also in the killing zone?
Minister!
I was asked to respond, and I'm very happy to do my best to do so.
Mr. Philip Oliver.
The extension to the transition period is designed to replace the backstop to the backstop. Given that the Irish government and Her Majesty's government have both said they're not going to build the hard border, who is?
Minister.
Well, I think we need to understand that the backstop is just that, and it's not expected that it will need to come into force. What we must do is secure an agreement, and we must come to arrangements that work for both sides.
And Lucas.
Mr. Speaker, in January, the Prime Minister promised ahead of the so-called meaningful vote that there would be a full economic impact assessment of the exit deal. Can he absolutely guarantee, A, that that will happen, and B, how much time will MPs have to consider it before we have to vote on the credibility of it or the lack of it?
We will have a considerable amount of material before the House. I will leave my right honourable friend, the DEXU Secretary, who's, I think, about to come to the dispatch box, who will have more information on that specific issue.
Jonathan Drogley.
Speaker, when looking at the Customs Union, would it not also be wise to look at the significant benefits of being in a trading bloc of 500 million people that has delivered wealth through some 40 FTAs with some 70 countries, agreements that the government has already said it wishes to adopt if we are able post-Brexit?
Minister!
I think it's important that we honour the decision of the British people. We come out with an arrangement that gives us the optimal long-term relationship with the EU, but also gives us an opportunity to exploit the opportunities that exist in the world economy that is growing faster beyond the EU.
Catherine McKinnell.
Last October, I asked the Chancellor in the Treasury Select Committee if the benefits of future trade deals, feasible future trade deals, outweigh the cost of leaving the single market and the customs union. He could not give me a clear response. Is the Treasury any closer to giving a clear response today?
Minister.
Well, such an answer is dependent on so many conditions and determinations of what was in those trade deals. So I'm sorry, I can't give a precise answer, no.
Increase the
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Minister finding withdrawing from the European Union as easy and cost-free as some of those behind him suggested?
Minister.
I think government is always challenging, and there are always issues that need to be resolved. I wouldn't, and I think it was self-evident that this is a challenging set of negotiations.
Ben Smith.
Mr. Speaker, would the Minister confirm that the head of the HMRC estimates that the cost of leaving the European Union, Customs Union, for British business would be £20 billion a year?
Minister.
I'm aware of that assessment. I think it depends on what assumptions around the final agreement that we come to. But clearly there are a range of concerned parties that the government is taking into account throughout this process.
Angela Smith.
Speaker, a lot has been said this afternoon about the strategic cost of Brexit, but every day thousands of civil servants are dedicating their working lives, working to the Prime Minister's direction, and yet the Prime Minister is sacrificing the interests of the country to try to heal divisions in her party on the benches opposite. When is the government going to get a grip and stop wasting taxpayers' money on delivering the impossible?
Well, the Chancellor has made money available across government to help us through this process. And I would acknowledge the massive contribution by our civil service to help across many departments of government. And the Prime Minister is committed to securing the best deal for the nation.
Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Leaving the customs union will cost us billions, but it's also costing us dear now. Does the Minister not agree with me that with violent crime rising, that the Home Office could have done with extra money to pay for an extra 4,500 police officers instead of £500 million to prepare for extra customs and border officials to leave the customs union?
Well, there's a budget next Monday, and it will be for the Chancellor to set out the spending settlement for the government departments.
Martin Dougherty-Hughes.
Mr. Speaker, can the Minister advise the patients of the Golden Jubilee Hospital in Clydebank in my constituency how patient they've got to be to have medicine regulation while Ricardio are taking out their health clinical trials for new heart medicines?
Well, the honourable gentleman makes a very sensible point around the urgency of securing a deal across lots of areas of our country, including the health service, and that's what the government's engaged in seeking to resolve.
Christian Matheson.
Mr. Speaker, the truth is this is typical crackpottery by the Brexit extremists on the other side of the House who seem to be running the show over there at the moment. But can the Minister tell us what will be the effect on the aerospace sector and Airbus next to my constituency of leaving as opposed outside of the customs union as opposed to remaining in and protecting those jobs?
Well, I think it's in the interests of aerospace and defence industries across the country for the government to come to the right solution, long-term solution, that secures jobs and certainty around its operating environment in the UK and trading abroad.
Anna McMorrin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Experts have found that Wales will be hit disproportionately hardest if the UK leaves the customs union and single market, with people up and down, communities and businesses hit hardest in Wales. Is the Minister prepared to make that sacrifice?
Well, I think the Prime Minister and the whole government is committed on finding a solution for the whole of the United Kingdom, and I recognise the different distribution of EU funds and therefore the policy challenges that will exist for the government thereafter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister's been asked 5 times to identify the figures for unemployment if we leave the customs union. So let's make it easier for him. Will unemployment go up or will it go down?
What I can say is that unemployment in this country is at a record low, demonstrating the coherence of this government's economic policy.
Henry Slaughter.
The Minister looks like he wishes he was somewhere else, and he's referred most of our questions to the Prime Minister, which I'm sure she's grateful for. He must be able to answer the question, does he stand by the Treasury forecast that this country will be worse off outside the customs union, the single market and the EU?
Minister.
What I stand by is the desire of the government to find the best possible solution for the United Kingdom that maximises the advantages to the UK economy of the growth in the economies outside the EU. There are a range of assumptions to a range of forecasts, and the Treasury always goes to considerable depth to set those out clearly.
Nick Thomas-Simmons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Manufacturers in my constituency need certainty, and yet in recent weeks we've had a backstop to the backstop, and now an extended transition. Isn't the truth that the government's chaotic approach to these negotiations is putting jobs at risk?
Minister.
What I can say is that we have got a short amount of time to secure the best outcome for the United Kingdom. It is urgent, and I recognise that the whole country needs to have that solution.
I'll take the 3 remaining questioners if it's a short sentence each, no more than that. Mrs. Madeline Moon, thank you.
Mr. Speaker, Ford Automotive in my constituency have made it clear that frictionless trade is essential. Canada, no matter how many pluses you put on it, isn't going to work. How will he ensure that 12,000 jobs associated with Ford are not going to be lost?
We'll secure that by observing the principles of the White Paper and getting the best deal through these negotiations.
Isn't it cheaper to just stay in the EU?
Minister.
This country voted to leave the EU by a narrow but clear majority. It's the job of government to deliver on that.
Sweeney.
Hey, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister not accept that any firm with operations spanning European supply chains will be worse off if we don't have a customs union?
Minister.
Well, that is why we've got to come to a conclusion to these negotiations that leave the United Kingdom in the best possible outcome with respect to the future economy.
Thank you. Order. Urgent question, Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Mr. Speaker, to ask the Secretary of State for the Department for Exiting the European Union if he will make a statement on Her Majesty's Government's policy on how any motion under Section 13(1)(b) of the EU Withdrawal Act 2018 is to be put before the House of Commons for decision.
The Secretary of State for Exiting the European Union, Secretary Dominic Raab.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I start by welcoming the question from my right honourable friend, the member for Beaconsfield. The EU Withdrawal Act 2018 confirmed in statute the government's long-standing commitment to provide Parliament with a vote on the terms of our final deal. Now, when it comes to the motion that will be considered, at the point when the approval of the House is sought, the decision as to whether this motion will be amendable or not is a matter for you, Mr. Speaker, not the government. However, the government has made clear our expectation, subject to your prerogatives, that this motion would be amendable. The government's response to the Exiting the European Union Select Committee's report, entitled Parliamentary Scrutiny and Approval of the Withdrawal Agreement and Negotiations on a Future Relationship, dated the 10th of October, stated, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, "Of course we accept that the Speaker may permit the tabling of amendments to the motion as is usual convention." Unquote. This understanding is also reflected in our response to the Procedure Committee's inquiry, which I provided on the 10th of October. Both of those responses were made publicly available on the committee's websites in the interest of transparency and to ensure this House understands the government's position on the matter. Although, again, I defer to the House and indeed to you, Mr. Speaker, on procedural matters which fall within the prerogatives of the House. Mr. Speaker, it will also be evident to honourable members that any amendments to the motion would not be able to affect amendments to the withdrawal agreement or the future framework which would have been agreed at the international level between the United Kingdom and the European Union. Nor could any such amendments delay or prevent our departure from the EU as set out under Article 50. It's worth just reminding the House that the timing of our departure from the EU is set out in international law under Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, which this House voted to trigger. The government committed to give Parliament a vote on the deal, and Section 13 of the EU Withdrawal Act 2018 sets out how that will happen. In passing that Act, Parliament confirmed its ultimate role in delivering on the will of the British people. Approving the final deal will be the responsibility of the House of Commons alone, a responsibility, Mr. Speaker, I know all honourable members will take very seriously indeed.
Thank you. Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I have every sympathy with procedural problems that the government may encounter and any honest attempt at finding a solution to them. I have to say that I find the government's position, as stated in the memorandum they've sent to the Procedure Committee, entirely unsatisfactory. It departs from the plain assurances given repeatedly to the House that we would be enabled to express a desire for alternatives when voting to reject or accept any deal. Just to remind my right honourable friend, when the right honourable gentleman, his predecessor, the member for Halton, Price and Howden, appeared in front of the Exiting the European Union Committee on the 25th of April, column 1383, the Chair said, "Can you give an assurance that the government's motion on the withdrawal agreement will be amendable, yes or no?" The right honourable gentleman, "Mr. Chairman, if you can tell me how to write an unamendable motion in the House of Commons, I will take a tutorial." But actually, one way of reading the memo is that is exactly what the government is planning to do. And I might add that these promises were repeated by my honourable friend, the member for Wickham, on the 18th of April 2018 in front of the Select Committee for the Constitution. and that throughout debates on the floor of the House, when we were looking in June at unamendable motions, no one on the government benches demurred from the oft-repeated statements that the motion on the substance of the deal would be amended. So, could my right honourable friend please tell the House how can he reconcile those statements with the government's plain submission to the Procedure Committee, recommending that a vote is first taken on the government motion and before amendments are considered? What happens if Parliament then approves the government motion but then amends it afterwards? Is the government then suggesting it's got what it needs to ratify or not? Surely the issue will be no clearer if the government adopts its method than the one it is criticising in the memo. And why, if there is a genuine problem over uncertainty, which I do understand, has the government not suggested allowing different motions and choices to be put to the House for a view to be expressed prior to the government motion being put? Why doesn't that feature in the government's submission at all? My right honourable friend knows a lot depends in this House on trust. And if I may say to him, the difficulty with the memorandum is that on one reading of it, I'm glad to hear what he said at the dispatch box, it tends to undermine trust that the government intends to honour the commitments it gave to the House.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I welcome my right honourable friend's question and indeed his comments, and let me try and address them if I may. He fears, if I understand correctly, that the government is in favour of an unamendable motion, but in fact, as the memorandum that he cites makes clear at paragraph 4, the approval will be a substantive motion. That was, I think, the first point he made, and therefore, under existing House procedures, will be amendable. So I hope that gives him some reassurance. But I think it is also worth just pointing out the implications that we set out in paragraph 6 that of the same memorandum, which was published on the 10th of October, which is that due to the legal status accorded to the motion under section 13 of the 2018 Act, which I know he scrutinised very carefully, a clear decision on approval of the motion is needed in order for the government to be able to ratify the withdrawal agreement. And I hope, again, that makes clear what the basic challenge is. If I understand him correctly, he may wish to change the terms of the agreement that has been struck. I think that would come up against the very real practical and diplomatic obstacles that so late in the day there wouldn't be time to revisit the negotiation. And secondly, just from a practical diplomatic point of view, is my right honourable friend really suggesting that at that point, we would actually be offered different or more favourable terms? I think it's unlikely in the extreme. It's very important that this House is presented with a very clear decision of the most meaningful sort available, which is between the terms of the best deal the government can negotiate and the alternative. And I hope and I'm sure that will focus minds when that point comes.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for granting the urgent question. Can I start by saying this? I profoundly disagree with the Prime Minister on a number of issues, including Brexit. But some of the quotes and comments about the Prime Minister this weekend attributed to Conservative MPs, ministers or former ministers, are nothing short of disgraceful. In a time of growing extremism, hostility and threats to those in public life, MPs should know better. They are, as ever, from unnamed sources, and I hope the House this afternoon can agree that this kind of language has no place in our politics and has to stop. Mr. Speaker, Labour has spent 18 months campaigning for a meaningful vote and for Parliament to be properly involved in the Brexit negotiations. Yet at every stage, the government's response has been to push Parliament away, and we fear this is the latest example. Labour is clear that Parliament must be able to express its view on any deal the Prime Minister brings back. Yet the Secretary of State's letter brings that into question. Of course, Labour recognises that Parliament will have to approve or disapprove any Brexit deal. It must be a decisive decision. but it's the role of Parliament and not the Executive to decide how that view is to be expressed. Labour has always believed that Parliament should be able to table, debate and vote on amendments. That's consistent, Mr Speaker, with paragraph 5 of the Government's own legal advice, which makes clear that absent a business motion being approved by the House, multiple amendments may be tabled. The selection of amendments and the order they're taken in is in the hands of the Speaker, and multiple amendments can be selected. So I want to be clear that Labour will not support any business motion that does not meet these criteria, and I urge the Secretary of State to think again. Thank you.
State.
Well, I thank the Shadow Brexit Secretary for his comments, and I agree with him about the tone of this debate. He's right that the meaningful vote needs to be a decisive decision. We set that out in the memorandum, and that is what Section 13 of the EU Withdrawal Act 2018 provides. And as the memorandum that we've published makes clear, we expect amendments to be allowed on the motion, although, again, that is an issue for you, Mr Speaker. I think the distinction that needs to be borne is between the likely impact that any procedural amendments would have on the withdrawal agreement at the international level. And the Shadow Brexit Secretary is far too assiduous and astute a lawyer to know that as a matter of basic law, that they could not have an effect of altering the withdrawal agreement. And also, I think common sense, he will know, means that it would be highly unlikely, if not impossible, for us to refer back to the negotiating table.
Anna Seabury.
Mr Speaker, may I gently say to the Secretary of State that, of course, he was in the Ministry of Justice, and in his ministerial role, he helped negotiate the passage of the bill that eventually became the Act, which is the subject of this urgent question. And I agree with the Right Honourable and Learned Member for Beaconsfield. This is a matter of trust. And it is quite incredible for the Secretary of State to stand up and basically say that as a former minister who navigated this bill through the House, that they didn't understand the consequences. And it's not just a matter of trust in Parliament and along the benches on this side. And my right honourable friend knows there were many members who were very concerned about all of this and who trusted the government that we would have a meaningful vote. But it's also amongst the people of this country. And if they think there's any breach in trust, they will not forgive this government.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady, my honourable friend. She will know, because it's set out in our memorandum, and I know she scrutinises these things very carefully, that we are amenable, subject to the prerogatives of the Speaker in the House, that this would be a motion with an amendable motion at that. She will also understand the need, and this is why it is a meaningful vote, of the very highest order, for there to be a clear decision that we are given on the deal that we're confident we can strike with our EU partners, so that we know whether we can proceed to implement it.
Mr Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I commend the Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield not only for submitting the question, but for the forensic way in which he has completely dismantled any credibility the government's position may have had. Can I also endorse in their entirety the comments from the Right Honourable Member for the Opposition about the appalling comments that have been made directed against the Prime Minister. I disagree with the Prime Minister on a lot of things, but nobody should be issued with the kind of threats that she's been expected to cope with over the last few days. Mr Speaker, the discussion now too much is about who will become the next Prime Minister. The long-term career prospects of the Prime Minister, or of any of us, are infinitesimally trivial compared with what will be at stake if and when this Parliament gets a chance to do its job in a meaningful vote. And that means not only a meaningful motion, it means we must be able to put forward and vote on meaningful amendments before the final decision was taken. So can the Secretary of State confirm that meaningful amendments will be allowed and that Parliament will have the opportunity to meaningfully amend the motion before we're asked to agree on the final deal? And can he tell us, given that we're getting hour by hour and minute by minute updates on the government's negotiations with a select 50 or so members of Parliament, when does the government intend to start seeking consensus across the 600 members of this House who are not members of the DUP or the European Research Group?
Well, I can assure the honourable gentleman that under the memorandum that we have sent to the Procedure Committee and that's been published, there will be a substantive motion, it will be amendable, and I don't expect any honourable member on any side of this House would table a meaningless amendment. So I reject the premise of the question in that regard.
John Redwood.
He confirmed that no motion of this House can overturn the 2 Acts of Parliament for withdrawal and the Article 50 letter, which all say we're leaving on the 29th of March next year, and that the government is not minded to repeal those acts.
My right honourable friend is right on both counts. This is nonetheless on the meaningful vote. It will be a substantive motion. It will be amendable, and it will be for you, Mr. Speaker, to decide on the scope and acceptability of those amendments.
Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Having read the Secretary of State's memorandum to the Procedure Committee, and paragraph 13 in particular, can I point out to him that the Select Committee's recommendation on amendments to the withdrawal agreement motion is that these would be taken before the vote on the main question and not after.
Absolutely.
And that is the issue here. So can the Secretary of State take this opportunity to accept both that that is what the Select Committee recommended, and also that to order the vote in any other way would be unacceptable to many, many members of this House?
Well, I always respect the views provided by the chair of the Select Committee, but the position is set out in the memorandum, and that's, we think, the proper course to make sure, yes, there's a meaningful vote, yes, there can be substantive amendments, but we also get a clear decision at the outset, at the outcome.
Nicky Morgan.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. When did the Secretary of State and the government get the legal advice that told them they needed this so-called clean motion first? Because I don't remember, and I don't think my colleagues remember, it being the subject of any discussions with ministers or whips in relation to this clause. When did they get it? Why did he feel it was appropriate to break that news to the Procedure Committee and not to members of his own party who he had discussions with?
Well, I have to say to my right honourable friend, we don't comment on legal advice, but it's obviously we've taken advice continually through the process of the EU withdrawal bill, and the issue of Section 13 and the process and the need for it, and also the importance of having a clear and decisive outcome to the meaningful vote, which is the surest way to make sure that it is meaningful and substantive, was discussed at length during the passage of that bill.
Yvette Cooper.
The Secretary of State seems to be arguing that we cannot discuss any amendments in advance simply because those amendments might not be ones the government agrees with, might be ones that won't give the government the legal support it wants, or might not agree with the government that there is no alternative to its motion. Well, I'm afraid those are the arguments that it should be making at the time we discuss those amendments, before we discuss the main motion in the normal way, because anything other than that is procedural ducking and diving to avoid the real substance of the debate and to avoid a meaningful vote.
Say to the right honourable lady, I don't think there was a question there, but as she will know, the selection of amendments and what the House can discuss is a matter for the Speaker.
To be fair, the Secretary of State, people will take whichever view they like. He's always an estimably courteous individual in the chamber, and we must hear the fellow. And Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you. Will my right honourable friend confirm once again that the choice is clear and the meaningful vote either to accept the government's proposition or to leave without a withdrawal agreement?
Well, I thank my honourable friend. He will know that Section 13 deals with what happened at some length and the procedural variations of what would need to happen in the event of Parliament not approving the deal that we do. And of course, in relation to all the other proxy debates that I think honourable members want to repeat in relation to the type of exit or the type of deal that we should negotiate, we have had 11 votes on single market or customs union type variations to the government's negotiating mandate, and the government in this House won each and every one.
Luciana Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clear from what the Secretary of State has just told us that his agreement is that his government is not offering this House a meaningful vote. How does it amount to Parliament taking back control if his government is now attempting to gag our democracy by preventing MPs from being able to amend the motion first?
I just gently refer the honourable lady to the memorandum, which makes clear there will be a substantive motion, and certainly it's our view, subject to the view of the Speaker, Mr. Speaker, that there would be amendments on it.
Dr. Philip Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When is the government going to accept that the time for negotiations are over, that the time for appeasing factions is over? The EU has consistently offered two options, Norway and Canada. Norway does not meet the expectations of the Brexit voting public, and Canada does not have a majority in this House. The government's latest attempt to stop Parliament from having a meaningful vote is yet more evidence that the foisting of a Brexit fudge on this Commons is imminent. 750,000 people in London on Saturday recognised these realities. When is the government going to do so too and give the British public a meaningful vote to get their informed consent to whatever Brexit is on offer or to remain in the European Union?
I thank my honourable friend. It was very inventive the way he got that in through the back door. But all I would gently say is that the basic democratic arithmetic suggests that several 100,000 protesting in what was an impressive protest cannot trump the will of 70 million who voted in a national referendum to leave the EU.
Angela Regal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the Minister has actually gone through the looking glass and left his dictionary behind him. He seems to think that meaningful actually means meaningless. And he seems to think in his topsy-turvy world that you can amend motions after you've voted on them. Why doesn't he get a grip, get back to the real world and give this Parliament the meaningful vote that his government and his colleagues promised us when they accepted that amendment?
Well, I thank the honourable lady, but I don't think she's right on either of the key points that she made. The memorandum that we published sets out very clearly that there will be a substantive motion. It will be, in our view, subject to amendments. What we can't have is a vote that renders meaningless the outcome of the referendum.
Well, of course, there has been much reference to the Procedure Committee, of which the honourable gentleman, the member for Gainsborough, is, of course, a distinguished ornament. Sir Edward Lee.
Ornament. Actually, to sum it up, the evidence given to the Procedure Committee last week was very clear. If there's no deal under 13.4, it's a motion on a neutral motion. If there is a deal, there has to be a meaningful vote under Section 13.1 of the Act. Amendments, that motion is amendable, and amendments must be taken first, unless the government produces its own business statement, and there has to be a vote on that. That is the procedure. But the important point to understand is that deal or no deal, meaningful vote, passed or not, can only affect the deal. It cannot affect the outcome of Brexit, because that is in statute. And only the government can introduce legislation, so only the government can stop Brexit on the 29th of March. Will the Secretary of State therefore give an unequivocal declaration to this House that under no circumstances, deal or no deal, deal rejected by the House or accepted, Brexit proceeds on the 29th of March?
Secretary of State.
I thank my honourable friend. The government is absolutely committed that we will give effect to the referendum and leave you in March of next year.
Mary Cray.
Speaker, the government only agreed to a meaningful vote on the final deal to avoid a parliamentary mutiny from their own side during the passage of the Withdrawal Act. He knows there is no majority in this place for a no-deal Brexit, and yet that, by implication, is what he is offering in his memorandum. When is he going to change his mind, or will we have to have another court case to the Supreme Court?
Well, I just say to the right honourable lady that is not our intention to go for no deal. We have been working tirelessly, and we continue to work through the October Council and into November to get the very best deal for the country. And we've made clear that we could deal with the no deal scenario, but it is a suboptimum outcome. What we want to do is get the best deal that works for the EU and the United Kingdom, and indeed all quarters of the country.
Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Come off it, Secretary of State. If a motion is amendable but not in a meaningful way, it's not a meaningful vote, and this House won't take it.
I thank my honourable friend. All I'd just gently say is that there's nothing meaningless about this vote at all. You would have actually one of the most groundbreaking decisions this House has had to decide for a generation, which is whether or not to accept the deal negotiated by this government with the EU that works for all parts of the United Kingdom. And I would hope that at that point we'd have some consensus in this House to accept the deal and move forward to the implementing legislation.
Stephen Doughty.
Mr. Speaker, let's cut to the chase. The government has tried to gag this Parliament at every turn in this process. Now, they have a choice. The position that the Minister is trying to put forward is essentially that it's no deal versus the deal that the government has. That is not politically, constitutionally or morally sound. Can the Secretary of State, further to my honourable friend, the member for Loughborough's question, explain whether or not he has taken legal advice on this, when he took it, and who commissioned it? Was it him?
I say to the gentleman, I have not commissioned any specific bespoke legal advice on the point that he's raising, but we have been informed right the way through about the implications. And when Section 13 was passed, obviously it was not just informed by the legal advice from government lawyers, but by all of the lawyers right across the House. And Section 13 was scrutinised very carefully in committee stage at length and will give effect to what this House voted through in that Act.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I understand it, all votes in this House are meaningful. That's the first thing. The second point is that the Act says the House will vote on whether the withdrawal agreement should stand or not. Now, so I might be voting against that agreement, but it will be the meaningful vote. Amendments would then follow if that motion was lost.
I say to my honourable friend, sections 13, paragraphs 4 to 6 set out the process, which includes the government coming back to Parliament if in the no-deal scenario. It's all set out very clearly in the legislation, amplified by the memorandum we've provided to the committee.
Chris Leslie.
The Minister just confessed that he's been caught red-handed trying to stitch up Parliament again, in the same way that they wouldn't publish papers, the same way they wouldn't share the impact assessments. They tried to grab Henry VIII powers at every possible twist and turn. They certainly won't let the public have a final say. And now he's trying to fix the arrangements so that we have amendments coming after a motion. He knows that this meaningful vote is in the legislation. It's the law. It's Parliament that decided that. We fought very hard for that outcome, and he shouldn't undermine or recant on that when it's MP's duty to have that meaningful vote.
I'd just say to the honourable gentleman that MPs will have their say on the meaningful vote. They have scrutinised at length every stage of the Brexit process, and of course it is not for the government or any minister to set which amendments are allowed. That will be for Mr. Speaker, and we've made clear that we accept and indeed we welcome the fact that we've got a substantive motion. Of course that means it should be amendable.
Jonathan Ginogly.
Speaker, once the Brexit deal has been secured, how long will it be before we move on to the meaningful vote, keeping in mind that select committees, for instance, will want to look at the terms of the deal in order to advise other honourable members?
Well, I think my honourable friend raised a very important point. We obviously want to bring forward the meaningful vote expeditiously because that gives us proper time for the scrutiny of all the legislation, but there must be time for the relevant select committees and indeed every honourable member of the House to scrutinise that carefully. We're a little bit dependent on the time that it takes for us to negotiate the deal, but I will certainly bear in mind the points that he's made, which I think are very important.
Liz Kendall.
The reality is the government promised this House a meaningful vote on the withdrawal agreement. Now they're trying to backtrack and say it's take it or leave it in an attempt to bully MPs into accepting whatever it is that this government manages to cobble together. His predecessor said, under the standing orders of the House of Commons, it is for the Speaker to decide whether a motion is amendable. Can he confirm it is also for Mr. Speaker to determine the order of those motions and any amendments? And if he thinks that isn't the case, will he publish the legal advice that says to the contrary?
Well, I have to say to the honourable lady, it is not for a minister to determine the ambit or remit or indeed the scopes of the prerogatives of the Speaker or this House, so we will of course respect them.
Mr. Philip Holloway.
The Brexit Secretary has said that he needs the negotiations finished by the end of November. If he reaches that target, will this House vote on deal or no deal before or after Christmas?
I thank my honourable friend. I think that the remarks I made were just reflecting the practical challenge on both sides, the EU and the UK, we would have with implementing legislation. But obviously there's a degree of flexibility to make sure that we have at the meaningful vote and at the legislative scrutiny stage as much time, and the right balance will be struck.
Take a very small number more, but colleagues will have opportunities also to question the Prime Minister, who's always very committed to the House. Mr. Ben Bradshaw.
What does he think the consequences would be if a majority in this House opposed the deal, opposed no deal, and perhaps even supported in those circumstances a people's vote if the government tried to thwart the will of this House being expressed and implemented?
We don't support a second referendum.
Heidi Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why, when in December last year this House voted for a meaningful vote on the final deal, subsequently and again today reassured us that any amendment on the motion on the subject of the deal will be a matter for the Speaker? Indeed, just last week the Prime Minister replied to me that in the case of no deal, it would come back to this House to agree next steps. Why is the Secretary of State now undoing all those good assurances by suggesting Parliament will now only have a token role in all of this?
Exactly.
Does the Secretary of State not accept this is a serious breach of trust? And I ask again, why did he seek to communicate this change to the Procedure Committee before the MPs in this House?
Well, say to the Honourable Lady, there's nothing tokenistic about the meaningful vote set out under Section 13, which will be on the deal that we do with the European Union, good for the UK, good for the EU, and the alternative, which is to leave the EU without that deal. The procedure that she refers to is spelt out very clearly in relation to Section 13, and of course this memorandum that she referred to was not somehow snuck out. It was given at the request of the Procedure Committee and made public so that every honourable member could see it.
Janet Cherry.
Mr. Speaker, a number of parliamentarians are trying to establish whether Article 50 can be unilaterally revoked, and the Court of Justice of the EU will hear that question on the 27th of November. If they say it can be revoked, does he accept that it would be open to this House to amend the government's motion ordaining them to take whatever action is necessary to revoke Article 50 and get us out of this unholy mess?
The government has no intention of supporting a second referendum or the revocation of Article 50.
Hammond. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the sake of absolute clarity, then, would the Secretary of State confirm that the neutral motion as described in Section 13, that statute cannot be described to, that statute cannot declare whether that motion is either neutral or can be standing orders can be disapplied? Yes.
Secretary of State.
Well, I think the technical answer to the question that he's asked is set out at some length in the memorandum, but if there's any doubt about it and he writes to me, I'll be happy to give him further clarification.
Speaker, the Institute for Government recommends that we have at least 5 days to discuss the deal that the government reaches. Can he guarantee that we will have at least 5 days?
We'll have as much time as we possibly can, but she will know that it is in part predicated on the time it takes to close the deal. We're confident that the remaining obstacles are narrowing and that we can get a good deal, but we're at least partly determined by the length of time to secure the end of the negotiations. That, of course, depends on the EU as well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You don't need to be a procedural junkie or one of the many historians in this House to know that here we vote on the amendments first. So can I ask the Secretary of State to give any example at all whenever in this House we voted on the amendments second?
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm not sure that is the simple answer, but what I would just say to the Honourable Lady is that we will have a substantive motion. It will be subject to amendment, and that will be for the Speaker to decide as she wants.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Speaker. The Secretary of State's memorandum justifies the ordering of this with the substantive motion coming first, which is highly unusual, of course, on the basis of Standing Order 31, which is for Opposition Day motions.
Yes.
On which planet could you describe this motion as an Opposition Day motion?
he may well be an expert on the standing orders, but all I would say to him is that on the substance of the issue, it's clear. There will be a clear decision for this House to accept the deal we negotiate with the EU or to leave the EU with no deal. And I know which side I will be on in relation to that debate, and we're confident we can get a good deal, and I hope he'll row behind it.
Tom Brake.
Mr. Speaker, does the Secretary of State understand that for many in this House, the only genuinely meaningful vote is one that allows MPs to vote for the deal or to vote to stay in the European Union, and for that vote to be ratified in the people's vote demanded by 700,000 people on Saturday?
We had that vote. It was in 2016, and the people decided to leave.
Mr. Frank Field.
Isn't it in the hands of the House of Commons to decide whether it wants a meaningful vote? We have backbench time. I'll be seeking time with support across the House to get past a motion which says if we do not approve the government's negotiating final position, the fallback position will be Norway and Canada, and that we won't pay money until the agreement's through.
Well, it's not for me to decide what procedures or motions the House puts forward, but all I would just do is repeat the point I made earlier. We've had 11 votes on potential single market customs union types variation to the negotiation strategy, and the government won each and every one of them.
Thank you. I'm sorry to disappoint remaining colleagues. My normal practice is to call everybody, but there are constraints of time and we must now move on. People will have the opportunity to question the Prime Minister. Order.